Our moderator today is Johns Hopkins' own Rob Reinishevitz.
Thank you, Sean. I take it that the primary function of this session is to allow you to ask questions, seeing as you've been kept from doing that the entire day, and you're probably eager to do that. To start off, I think if anybody wants to raise a question, be brave enough to do so.
Might as well start off with following up on Anil's amazing talk and EJ's follow-up. So I don't know if I found it in your BBS article, but one thing that strikes me as a major difference between LLMs, at least, and biological consciousness is the continuity of time, the so-called stream of consciousness. So that, like, when you make a query and you get an answer, it gives you that answer. Some computation occurs or has occurred and is sort of banked in the learned weights of the model. But we experience consciousness as a continuum, even in the absence of certain sensory inputs, and even in some sort of distortions of the temporal perception of time itself. Is there any, I'm naive about this, but is there anyone looking into including that in artificial systems? And that would run against your cautionary tale of do not try to bridge this gap. But do you see that as a potential thing that biology instantiates that artificial systems don't, or is that just a thing people haven't chosen to attempt to implement in artificial systems?
I think it's more the latter. So I think what the issue of time is, as it stands, quite a major difference. And you're right to focus on it. I didn't mention it, but in Turing computation, time is sequence matters, but time doesn't, right? And you see this in language models too. But in brains, time matters, and they're continuous systems. There's still ongoing debates in neuroscience about whether perceptual experience is discrete or continuous, and whether we sort of infer temporal continuity from sort of snapshots that are discrete. But the underlying wetware is pretty continuous. Spikes are discrete, but many other things are continuous. So that is a difference. And as you say, conscious experience unfolds continuously in time, apart from when you have general anesthesia. But there are plenty of other ways of building systems where you can reintroduce that kind of continuity. So there's a whole tradition of analog computing too. And there you're back in the realm of continuous temporal systems. So it's not out of the range. It may be a variable that matters, but I'm not sure it's like EJ said, well, what else matters? And I don't think that's a difference that is likely to make a difference, but it's still an important difference in explaining the nature of human brains and how they're different from computers as we know them.
Could I just ask a follow-up question? Now, are you assuming that states of consciousness are instantaneous and update continuously, or?
Well, that's another good question. I mean, we don't really know. So there's a whole William James, one of the founders of psychology, always talks about consciousness as this sort of specious presence. So there's something about, the phenomenology of conscious experience that seems to extrude a little bit into the future and reside a little bit in the past. Even a present moment has a sort of temporal thickness rather than just being a single instantaneous moment.
James was talking about perceived time, right?
Well, no, he was talking about
not the actual functioning of consciousness as produced by the brain was something that was updated continuously, because there actually is a present along with the specious present. There's a point that is supposed to mark the now. So, but yeah.
To continue the thread of this very seductive question, as you mentioned in your slides about AI consciousness, I find it quite curious that skeptics of AI consciousness also come across as reductive physicalists. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you would also be a reductive physicalist. And it seems to me that reductive physicalists should actually endorse the, at least in principle, eventuality of AI consciousness for the following claim. If AI were to ever be embodied in a physically or functionally isomorphic system to that of conscious beings like us, then they would in fact be consciousness. And this is because of a strict relation that should hold between mental states and physical states of some relative fundamentality, whether that's supervenience or dependence or whatever have you. And to deny that strict relation would, actually be anti-physicalist. So can I understand the arguments that you're making for biological naturalism to just deny the antecedent that AI could never actually be embodied in a physically or functionally isomorphic system as that of conscious beings?
Thanks for that. I'll answer. I also just do want to not suffer overly from the recency effect of there have been amazing talks before this, all of them. But so, I mean, I describe myself as a pragmatic materialist, right? I think I feel we should hold our metaphysics quite lightly about these things. And I find materialism useful because it's in the way it generates theories with explanatory power and testable predictions. But I don't know if materialism is true. But you're quite right that if taking that commitment at face value means that if you get the physical, if you replicate the necessary and sufficient physical properties in something else, you will get consciousness. That's totally fine. I'm totally on board with that. The question is, what are those physical properties that matter? They may be distinctively biological. They may be merely computational. There may be some other middle ground that matters, and we don't know. And that's the the kind of adventure that I'm on, away from the general assumption that computation is enough, despite the very cogent responses from EJ, towards the idea that some other aspects of the physical world might indeed matter. But yeah, you can create a synthetic consciousness every time somebody has a child. They do that. Maybe not an intelligent one, but conscious one.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask Alan Guth a question from the going back to the morning session. I think I'll want to follow up later about the countable additivity and the probability distribution. But for now, what I want to say is, I think you had this argument that if we had a maximum entropy state, then we would expect this sort of eternal recurrence type thing where we have these Boltzmann brains constantly forming, and it would be surprising or difficult to explain on that sort of picture why we find ourselves as life in a galaxy, in one of several 10 to the 11 galaxies or whatever it is. But then this raises the question to me in this alternative framework that you propose, where we have this unbounded entropy, and then with extremely high probability, we have an initial condition that starts in a low entropy state, and then eventually, as we follow the evolution either forwards or backwards in time, we end up with this. Now, in the toy model, what it looks like to me is that we end up with this extremely dilute collection of particles that are really far from the sphere. And at that point, that doesn't obviously, so we have in that point a sort of an error of time now emerged, and we have a direction of entropy. But this doesn't look like the sort of system with a direction to it that could support something like life as we know it. And I guess the question I'm wondering, so I think one of the things that's often interesting in a lot of these cosmological explanations of life is that we want to see there might be, tying into the other talks, these different ways that life could be realized in a physical universe. Should we expect that this probability explanation that gets us this two-directional error of time also gets this two-directional entropy that is working in a way that is hospitable for something that we might recognize as agents that have experiences like ours, rather than the Boltzmann brains or something else extremely alien?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That, of course, concerns a part of the talk that I didn't give any details about. Frankly, we're not entirely sure of all the details that are relevant there. But I did say, and I'll try to elaborate on, that we regard this toy model as a metaphor for eternal inflation. So the toy model just has point particles that go out, and they certainly don't look like they're going to form anything living or anything very interesting. But in an eternally inflating universe, I should explain a little more how that works. In an eternally inflating universe, one has a backbone of exponentially expanding space filled with a scalar field in a high energy state, which is driving this exponential expansion. And then, as we understand it, places the scalar field undergoes a transition, and one has a local Big Bang, producing a universe that would presumably look reasonably like ours. And this would happen over and over again. So as we watch the system evolve towards what we would call the future, more and more of these pocket universes would form. And every one of them would start with a Big Bang similar to ours. And if our universe can produce life, so could many of those. Now, I shouldn't act like they're all identical. It's also very likely that we have a situation, which is what string theory predicts, where there are many different kinds of vacuum, not just the kind that we see around us. And each one of these pocket universes would essentially choose its own version of the vacuum as it nucleates. So many of them would have different kinds of vacua that may not support life, but there would still be an infinite number, exactly like ours, ultimately, that would support life in the same way our universe does. And this would go on forever. Boltzmann brains could also be produced, and then it's a complicated question to decide whether the Boltzmann brain will dominate or not. And that leads to another very important question about the multiverse that I did not go into in my talk, but there's something called the measure problem, which amounts to the fact that we don't really know how to define probabilities in this eternally inflating universe. There are too many infinities floating around. We don't know how to deal with them. When I say we don't know how to, I should qualify that a bit. We can invent recipes that make sense, that give reasonable results for defining probabilities in an eternally inflating multiverse. But we have no way at the moment of saying this recipe is the right one. We really don't know what the criterion is even. But in any case, for some of these recipes, real life will always dominate over the Boltzmann brains. And that's what apparently happens to the extent that this is an accurate description of reality.
Thanks to all of you for fascinating talks. My question is for Emily and Simon and anyone else who wants to comment. So Emily, in your talk, you talked about some of the problems with current AI systems, like your example with Gemini producing proofs with subtle errors. And it's really a challenge to get them to be able to check their own work and so on. And you also talked about the idea of AI systems being used possibly to do this formalization. But it seems like there's other aspects of mathematics, other activities in mathematics that are very important. And I'm wondering, we hear from people like Sam Altman and others that we're soon going to get machines that are smarter than the smartest mathematician. I mean, I think that's like a quote. And the question is, what activities of mathematics are these people envisioning for AI to replace? And what are your thoughts, any of you, on what's the most challenging thing for AI systems in mathematics?
Great. I love that question because it's a very interesting and very live conversation within the mathematics community that I don't think my talk really represented well at all. I think a lot of the excitement in mathematics right now is about collaborations between mathematicians and AI. So in particular, in what might be called experimental mathematics, which is searching a prescribed space of mathematical objects for something with an unusual characteristic. There have been some high-profile collaborations where human mathematicians very carefully select a particular problem and code up some reward function so that the neural network could be motivated to attack it. And in none of the cases that I'm aware of has the AI sort of quote unquote found an answer, but it's led the humans to analyze the data and state a conjecture, and then with a lot of work prove the conjecture. And so these are some sort of mathematical discoveries that I think are enabled by this technology that would have been more difficult before. And it's sort of continuity with other uses of computer tools in mathematical discovery, such as SAT solvers that were mentioned, or computer algebra systems, or sort of numerical calculation tools. So I think there are, so I should try to get to your question. So, I mean, you know, there's a lot of different computer architectures that are relevant to different aspects of mathematics. And one of the things I haven't seen a lot of energy towards from the companies, the tech companies that I'm maybe not following quite as closely as I don't have any insider knowledge, is integration between architectures that are good at different things. So, you know, it drives me completely bananas that, you know, you can't add in any of these, you know, quote unquote intelligent systems. You know, I would like to see some development towards, you know, integrating software that is designed for a particular task and efficient at a particular task, because the time and the energy use also matters with something like this. I think I'm very skeptical, though, that an AI is going to be better than mathematicians at original mathematics anytime in their near future. I mean, certainly an AI might be, you know, quote unquote, more widely read than a mathematician. And if, you know, we could sort of stop hallucinating, it'll have better command of the literature. If we could have sort of better sourced answers, you know, it could be a very strong tool for professional mathematicians. And I know some mathematicians who are starting to use it that way. But in terms of, you know, some sort of autonomous agent that is as good at giving a logical argument as humans are, and not just spitting out a logical argument that it's heard somewhere, I don't know. I'm personally skeptical, but maybe Simon has different thoughts. Maybe on the side.
I think it's really good to take the people close to the bone seriously. So I might have lowered my opinion of AI from Emily's talk. So
There's some work at
there's some good work. You know, there is. There's lovely work at my home institution, or one of my homes. But I think Melanie, you asked about what are some of the big challenges, and one of the things that I got very curious about is that what you might think of as the frame problem for theorem proving. So in one sense, I can fantasize that, you know, the hallucinating natural language can hook up to some lean system and start actually proving theorems, and we can check it. But I think we might struggle with whether or not the machine is proving things about the same objects that we had in mind, and trying to line up the definitions that, you know, as Emily pointed out, when you look in Lean or you look at one of these automated proof assistants, the definitions look so alien to you potentially that you're never quite sure, like, did I just prove Fermat's last theorem, or did I prove something utterly trivial because secretly sitting in there somewhere, I have defined something that is, I've missed some aspect of the definition that makes it null. And so in the same way, you might ask, like, is the machine really talking about New York in the same way I mean New York? I think we might struggle with, is the machine really doing infinity categories the way mathematicians, like human mathematicians, think about it? Or is it engaged in some kind of weird, infinity prime reasoning that has nothing to do with what we really care about?
Hi, I'm Betsy. I work on foundations of statistics and causal inference. And my question is for Simon and maybe Emily by association. So Simon, I think you said that proofs without good reason are dense, and that this is poses a problem for the idea that like mathematicians have a nose for truth. And I'm wondering if it's possible that there are like deep theorems and contingent theorems, and human readable proofs are more dense in deep theorems.
I think there are, I couldn't prove these theorems, but I think if you had some algorithm that enabled you to wander the space and only hit the human provable theorems, you would have strange computational superpowers that would violate some of the underlying tenets we have about how computational complexity works. So I think we're pointing to a challenge here for what we mean by mathematical intuition. It certainly exists. People have better and worse. Like I have terrible taste in mathematics, and Tim Gowers has amazing taste. But I think we're really struggling to figure out exactly how they can sort of pick the deep theorems. I mean, certainly when I put up, the theorems that we've proved by machine, it's like Sudoku puzzles. Come on, right? Like Pythagorean triangles. They obviously don't seem quite as deep. But I'm not sure that that will always be true. I think we may start stumbling upon deep theorems that don't have these efficient proofs. I'm not sure if I've spoken to your question, though.
The latter part did. I guess I see the problem with an intuition, but I struggle because I do want to believe that there are kind of like there are theorems that constitute the notion of beauty that we have in math, and that those are somehow going to be more amenable to human readable proofs. Setting aside the problem of what you use to navigate a search between the two.
I think it's a beautiful, it's a meta beautiful question, but I think Emily, I'm sure, has plenty of thoughts on it.
I'm glad you brought up beauty. I was going to bring up something related or a component of beauty, which is whether the theorem is interesting. And one reason a theorem could be interesting is that having resolved it, it's a powerful tool to have in your toolkit to prove other theorems. And in that case, even if the proof is terrible, the theorem is still useful and so perhaps interesting in that sense. But a lot of what is interesting interesting because it's explanatory. It makes us see the mathematical universe more clearly. That's something that mathematicians find beautiful. And I think the theorems that are interesting because of their explanatory power, that often is not just in the statement, but also contained in the ideas that go into the proof of that statement. So I would say those are disproportionately represented by the theorems in whatever your small universe was. I forget exactly.
Yeah, right. I had a parlor game of making fun of mathematicians for proving things we already know are true, like why did we need the proof? And one remark that somebody said was like, look, if we were to prove that, the proof strategy that we would use would probably combine really diverse chunks of mathematics. Now that's legit, right? A mathematician can say, oh, if I were to try to prove that and that proof were to fall, it would involve linking together really disparate parts of these fields. We tend to feel that that's explanatory, and there's no magic there, right? That's just how would I get from New York to LA? Well, I have to go through the Midwest. I'll see something. So I think there are ways to understand the beauty of a theorem, but only potentially with the kind of attack a mathematician might choose. We can do it a long time. But thanks, lovely question. Thank you.
I feel like this is a follow-up question to the previous question, but I'd like to expand it to the whole panel as well. This involves a little bit about consciousness and computation and proof. So we find ourselves, I wrote it down because I don't want to ramble around. So we find ourselves in a reality where truths, where we have truths that are efficiently provable, but also some truths that may as well be uncomputable, like uncomputable functions. So a question to Emily is, do you think there is a way where we can, do you think there is a systematic procedure to attach somewhat loose Busy-Beaver upper bound for all mathematical statements so that we can somehow quantify, okay, this is probably a very complicated problem versus this is somewhat complicated problem. We're at the Busy-Beaver level of 5-ish, maybe in a few hundred years, maybe we will attack all of the problems at higher level or something like that. That's a question to you. And the question to the whole panel is, so imagine there is a mathematician who just proved some uncomputable statement about mathematics. Now, if that's the case, I think there is no doubt that the mathematician himself or herself is conscious. Now, given that the statement itself is uncomputable, all of this gladly and blatantly confabulating AI, surely that cannot prove that proof, whatever that proof is. Now, is that an argument that there exist multiple levels or orders of consciousness? Because surely that mathematician achieves something that is just computationally unachievable by a computational model. I'm not sure if I made sense, and if not, I'll explain or follow up.
I'm going to defer this question because I haven't thought very much at all about the computational complexity of mathematical theorems. So someone else?
Sorry, on the questions of the whole panel, I mean, this is very reminiscent of a famous argument from Roger Penrose, like way back in the day. And you know, it was actually the first book I read on consciousness in 1991, and it almost put me off doing it entirely, because I learned a lot about Hilbert spaces, but nothing about consciousness. You know, that's the argument, right? That there are some things which we human beings can sort of see to be true, but are non-computable. I've always worried, I don't really know how relevant it is to understanding consciousness, because on the one hand, like, you know, with the Gödel theorem that well, we might just have the wrong formal system. It could be another formal system in which that could be the case. But on the other hand, it's just like there are so many reasons why you know, the brain is not that kind of system anyway. You know, this being continuous, it being, you know, just stochastic. Or there are many simpler reasons why the brain might be able to do things that are non-computable within a formal system. So I don't think it has that much relevance in my mind to the question of consciousness anymore. And then Penrose went sort of like, well, if it's not that, it must be quantum things collapsing, and that to me was a sort of I didn't quite follow him on that leap. Let's just put it that way.
Question for Jennifer Nagel. Is consciousness relevant to common knowledge? Life is critical, essential to consciousness is one of the postulates that we heard. Awareness of self and others, is that needed for the dyad that you speak of? Should we be talking about how agents, conscious agents, actually communicate and what comes out of that discussion?
So for us, common knowledge is possible, at least in part, because we're coasting on kinship. You and I are creatures of the same kind. And in our species, there seems to be a link between consciousness and common knowledge. But I think the general architecture of common knowledge is something that could be implemented in, for example, multi-agent reinforcement learning systems, if they had the right architecture and without consciousness. So yes and no. Yes for us, but no, not necessarily in general. So I actually do think that artificially intelligent systems can have mental states, and that they are capable of knowledge. I think that's something that is separate from the question of whether they are sentient in the sense of having consciousness. I don't know if that helps or makes things worse.
I thought you had momentarily at the beginning said that because we share a kinship, human to human.
Yeah.
And that's the basis of common knowledge. That would seem to suggest that we're not able to share common knowledge with AI.
Oh, no, I was thinking of AI systems where you have artificial agents that are achieving common knowledge amongst themselves.
Yes.
So you could have a swarm of AI. They're coasting on kinship with each other. We might, from our God's eye perspective, looking down on the system, in fact, see that this is taking place.
Do you have an opinion on the hybrid of human and AI ecosystem, common knowledge?
So that's not something that would be natural or spontaneous for us, but it's something that we might be able to make that work. It's natural and spontaneous for the two of us as speakers of a shared language, that we can achieve common knowledge right now in this dyadic interaction. Actually, even if we didn't speak the same natural language, we might be able to achieve, for example, joint perceptual attention. I could direct your attention to something and we
go to a foreign country and ask for directions, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up? Because I was struck when you were talking, I really like the way of putting it when you say for common knowledge, it's not this sort of infinite recursion, I know that you know that I know, but that there's a sense in which the dyad is doing something together. And that made me think of what I was supposed to be talking about, which was these measures of emergence. And, you know, there's various things, like there's these, you know, partial information decomposition approaches where you can measure the synergy in a sort of multi-component system and quantify the amount of information that's in both together that's not traceable to one or the other individually. And yeah, it struck me, well, maybe that's a way of kind of quantifying, common knowledge in a system that would generalize, to other kinds of systems.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of empirical work that's actually directly relevant to this. So I'm thinking particularly of work of the type that Christopher Frith has been doing. He's this consciousness is for sharing guy, very interested in the experimental conditions under which two minds are better than one. So when can two people charged with jointly making a very subtle perceptual task outperform the better of the two agents on their own? It seems to be that in those cases, if we're allowed to vocalize our metacognition, if we're allowed to not just express our judgment, but give some indication of how sure we are about it, in those conditions, we can outperform the better agent on their own. And I think that, yeah, you could absolutely quantify the kind of gain you get from having that kind of system. Thanks for the question, by the way. Great question.
Another question for Jennifer Nagel. So Stephen Gross's example of the loudspeaker in the waiting room got me thinking about the ways in which practices of dyads for seeking common ground might leak into situations where one of the members is like not present, such as a broadcast situation. And the case I thought of is where in the history of writing, we've transitioned from scripta continua with no punctuation to insertions of punctuation. And there's a theory that that was because it was taking too long to train orators of Catholic scripts to actually say the things properly. And if you don't say the things with the right pauses, Augustine showed that you can have, blasphemous statements. So you put in punctuation, and this way it gets prepackaged with the right semantics and pragmatics, even though you're not actually having a conversation. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how this can work, or does that actually happen very often, where we take the pragmatics of a dyad and we try to blister pack it into broadcasting, for example?
Oh, excellent question. So I'm always fascinated by the transition that we make from dialogue, which is natural and spontaneous, leave a group of people in a room together who share a common language and take away their phones. And pretty soon they'll, some kind of conversation will burst out. Vows of silence are incredibly rare. But writing is something that is learned and artificial and difficult, and it's sort of hard to maintain attention in it. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested by the extent to which monographs, and I'm thinking particularly philosophy, but I'm sure in other disciplines as well, have to simulate a dyad within themselves. So in a philosophical text, possible exception of Spinoza's Ethics, but not the Tractatus, the logical political Tractatus, which is much more readable. But in most philosophical texts, you have something of a dialogue. You have it very explicitly in Plato, but even in an author like René Descartes, there's a back and forth. There's how am I so sure? There's actually even the personification of this crazy character, the evil genius, and you have to struggle against him. But it's incredibly tedious just to read. Sorry, mathematicians. It's incredibly tedious just to read something that's reasoning from first principles without any back and forth, without any objections and replies. I mean, of course, if you're trained, then it's exciting and it's cool and that's all right. But like for ordinary mortals, but we can get excited in things if there's some kind of dynamic of questioning and then responding, motivating the problem and then replying. I guess you guys even do that in math. And so I think it's sort of a Vygotskian idea that in lengthy storytelling, maybe you have to do a little bit of internalization of the dyad. If I'm going to hold your attention with a story for a long time, there better be some speakers in it who interact with each other. It's very rare to read a novel in which there is no dialogue. That would be actually kind of boring, maybe. TV shows, too, have to have some kind of dialogue going on, unless it's one of those sort of Swedish slow television things that's designed to put you to sleep. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, that was excellent. Thanks.
Thanks.
So I just have to interject. I mean, the normative pronoun that's used in mathematical writing is we, because there's right, because of this sort of shared understanding with the reader that's being developed over the course of the boring logical argument.
Okay, thanks.
It's a really interesting. I mean, when I was listening to your talk, Anil, I'm thinking there's a lot of stuff where it's like, oh, like, is the vibe that this thing is conscious, right? And that's basically my level of philosophy at this point for consciousness. If I think about some of the art forms you mentioned, like take Ex Machina, right? It seems to me that once the machine starts doing theory of mind on us, we're much more likely to attribute conscious experience to it. And I think that's also true for animals. If I think my cat is modeling me and forming beliefs about what's in my head, I feel more likely that it's conscious. If once we realize the machine is modeling the humans in the room, it feels like we ought to attribute consciousness to it. So that's not data, but it speaks to this question of what's the role of common knowledge and theory of mind in conscious experience. It seems non-trivial to me.
I'd like to thank the panel for their contributions and research. It's been very interesting. And this question is mainly directed toward Dr. Nagel, but maybe also Dr. Seth by proxy. You mentioned that dyadic judgment can kind of induce a sort of greater intelligence in a way. And I'm kind of curious if you feel like there's a point in which adding individuals to the conversation will increase the quote unquote intelligence, but if there's a point where it collapses and the intelligence contributions become almost insignificant or maybe negative in a way. I'm just curious what your thoughts on that would be.
Thanks, Matteo, for the question. Excellent question. It is Matteo, right?
Matios.
Matios, damn.
It's a little tricky, yeah.
Excellent question. So there's a lot of work by the British anthropologist Robin Dunbar on size of conversational groups. And, they have hidden cameras at garden parties, that kind of thing. And they look at how many people cluster in conversational groups where you have arbitrarily large numbers able to join. And it's very rare to have conversational groups that are larger than 5 people. If you've ever been at a dinner party or something like that, you get 8 people at the table, that is going to pretty soon break down into smaller groups. So groups of more than 4 are vanishingly rare in spontaneous conversation. And actually, even if you have a group of just 3 people, it's usually serially dyadic. So Gail Stivers has done a lot of work on that. So the other day I was talking to you and your brother, and I'd be looking at you for a while, and then we chat, and then look at your brother, and sometimes you'd be looking at each other. And so we have a speaker, an addressee, and a ratified participant on the side who's watching both of us, and we'll move to him and incorporate him from time to time. I think there's a computational burden in having a large number of people because I, as speaker, have to watch for everybody's buy-in. When I'm in this kind of group and I have a large number of addressees, I stop looking for buy-in, which is partly why the quality of my contribution falls if I have a large audience, because I'm not necessarily meeting the moment. I'm not necessarily satisfying everybody. Someone back there has a puzzled expression or didn't catch what I said, and they're now checking their phone or whatever. Whereas one-on-one, face-to-face, we don't do that. So if you get large groups, there is some deterioration in the gain. Sometimes there's other things that you start having with large groups. So with large groups, laughter becomes more important because that's an immediately shared thing. I feel like this is something that Simon Tadeo would know a lot about, so I'm going to just pass the microphone on to him, if I may.
These are lovely thoughts. I've never had them before.
I just only an anecdote to add. I did my postdoc in San Diego at the place called the Neuroscience Institute, and when I got there, it's a beautifully architected building. Everything's been thought about, and where we had lunch, there's about 40 scientists, and we were all there are many different disciplines, and the lunch place was designed with tables that could seat maximum 6 people by design, so that it was enough to ensure diversity. So if it was smaller, you could cluster with the people doing what you did, and if it was any bigger, it would fractionate. And indeed, it worked. And there's many examples of work that can be traced to the design of those lunch tables. Like a good friend of mine works at Queensland Brain Institute, doing sort of electrophysiology on fruit flies and sort of studying consciousness in fruit flies. And he only did that because of the discussions around the lunch table. He came as a fruit fly geneticist. And so it really, anecdotally, it worked there. So I think it works always. That's anecdote, isn't it? Proof by anecdote.
Okay. So I have 3 siblings and 2 parents, so we're basically like the perfect amount of people, I guess you could say.
Perfect.
Neuroscientifically speaking. Thank you very much.
I'd also like to thank everyone for very interesting presentations. My question is a historical question, and it's to Anil. You mentioned McCullough and Pitts, and certainly the idea of artificial neural networks emanated from their work. McCullough was a neuroscientist. Am I correct in believing that their work was far more important to the development of AI than to neuroscience? Is that accurate?
It's hard to say. I think both, really, and I think underappreciated in both dimensions. So I think at the birth of AI, and there are people in the room who know much more about this than me, but there was this sort of other way it could have gone, this whole direction of cybernetics, which was all about control and communication and regulation rather than sort of abstract symbol processing. And that branch of AI got almost completely neglected until it started resurfacing in various guises in the 1990s and so on. And even the neural network thing, I think most people will know, this was kind of written off for a long time. There was this sort of famous supposed proof, again back to proofs, that there was limits on what simple neural networks could do, these perceptron things, and took the sort of new methods of training deep neural networks to sort of overcome those and do much more interesting things. But at the same time, the contributions to neuroscience, it sort of depends which way you what kind of neuroscience you're talking about. But certainly that level of abstraction, I think it was very important because it at least, it was probably more important for psychologists interested in neuroscience rather than neuroscientists themselves. Because I remember early textbooks, the sort of cognitive neuroscience were very much box and arrows, sort of inspired by the more symbol processing architectures in AI. And these historical work on neural networks encouraged attention to the level of neuronal circuitry, which I think has been very, very important in neuroscience too.
Thank you.
Before we get into double dipping, I wanted to ask David Albert a question about something I didn't really get, and it seemed like an important point, and that was Adam Alga's example of bringing about the Atlantis in the past. Can you just make that intuitive for me?
Sure. You want to know what you want to know how a certain feature of the present state of the world. You want to know how. You want to know how features of the world at other times counterfactually depend on its present features. Okay, and you're interested in knowing this because you're imagining that there are very small features of the present state of the world, the positions of your fingers, the tensions in your muscles, so on and so forth, that you adopt a sort of fiction towards yourself to the effect that you can control those directly, and you're interested in what control over those can be parlayed into via the laws of physics. So you write down some algorithm for evaluating counterfactuals. Okay. You imagine that my finger is here instead of here. You look for the world. You look for the state of the world which is in some reasonable sense as close as possible to the original one, except that my finger is in a different location. There's a long history of trouble about what the right way of doing that is, but forget about all that. Elga point, and then you just plug that in as an initial condition to the physical laws, and calculate forwards and backwards, and that's how you evaluate your counterfactuals. Elga imagined a state in which, in fact, Atlantis existed, okay, but all present macroscopic records of it have been wiped out, have been dissolved into the general environment, in such a way that if you were simply to conditionalize this big probability distribution called the mentaculus on the present macro state of the world, or what you knew of the present macro state of the world, then the probability of Atlantis existing based on that would be very, very low. What that indicates is that on the actual trajectory of the world, by stipulation, Atlantis did exist, but its existence is now extremely sensitive to small perturbations in the present microscopic state of the world. So it looks like it's going to be a true counterfactual that if my finger had been here instead of here, Atlantis wouldn't have existed. So it looks like I'm having enormous effects on past states of the world by small, by small changes in the conditions now. That was I don't want to drag us into a long story here. There was this way of evaluating counterfactuals and plugging in the laws of physics was advertised as something which, in the context of this mentaculus with a past hypothesis, was going to give us the result that past states of the world hardly depended counterfactually on present states at all, but future states could often depend in a dramatic way counterfactually on present states, and that this would be a way of understanding our intuition that by acting now we can control the future, or we can have effects on the future, but not on the past. Elga brought this example as a counterexample, and it was indeed a very interesting counterexample. I think there's a way for this view to talk itself out of it, where you end up saying, look, that's right. There is a big counterfactual dependence, but it is necessarily the kind of counterfactual dependence that can only arise in situations where we're not aware that it obtains. Okay, so that there might be this very big counterfactual dependence that's still compatible with an explanation of our conviction that there's no such dependence. So that's what that was about. This was one of a number of bumps on the road of this program. Like I said, after that, other interesting objections were raised by Matthias Frisch and Alison Fernandez and other people. And you've had to add a lot of bumps. You had to add a lot of bells and whistles to this account, like saying, okay, but it doesn't count because we're not aware of it, and so on and so forth. And there's been a question about where all that is going, and whether the account is beginning to look less attractive on the grounds of that, whether you have to incorporate a more detailed description of agency of the kind that Janan has done a lot of work on. So anyway, it's a long story, but that's what the Elga objection was about.
Thank you. Next question. And this may be the last one. In fact, it probably will be.
Well, I hope it's a good one. Thank you, the speakers, and Janan and Sean, for organizing. It's been a really fun day for me. There's this paper written several years ago about LLMs being stochastic parrots. And for me, it's pretty obvious that they are. What's less obvious to me is that I'm not. And so I wonder, just for anyone on the panel, what's your take on the extent to which you or I are not stochastic parrots, and why? This is, at the level of us doing computational inference. Now, obviously, we also have bodies and they don't, but just at the pure inferential level, I can't tell that I'm not one. So I'd like your help with that. Thank you.
I have a short answer. Stochastic parrots are in P, but we often solve problems that are in NP or co-NP. Machines run on vibes. They run on, I think these systems are very much pattern matching systems. That's what we do a lot of the time. We make quick snap judgments. But whenever I've tried to get a machine to think, whenever I try to get these LLMs to think deeply, the only way it can really do it is by stringing together lots of vibes in a kind of iterative fashion. So I think that's how I know I'm not a parrot, but I don't know, others?
I have to take this as an epistemologist. Look, you might not know first person through introspection that you're not a stochastic parrot, but I can know it from where I stand because I think the activity that you're engaged in right now, you're asking a question because you want to know the answer. That's not something that large language models are capable of doing.
I think it's just very unfair on parrots. Right.
Okay, with that, let's see, we've got 4 zeros on the clock. And so I'd like to thank our panel. And,
thank you.